In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. I always give a disclaimer at the beginning of each episode, but I want to give an extra disclaimer here as this episode deals with the death of a child. So please keep that in mind and take care of yourself. On Thursday, July 12th, 1979, at 2:15 p.m., a call came in reporting a fire at a motel in Red Oak, Iowa. Red Oak is a small town in southwestern Iowa, and its population in 1979 was around 6,800 people. The motel in Red Oak was the Hill Top Motel, and it was at 1303 Summit Street. Now, this motel has since been demolished, but at the time it had 11 rooms and also a 3-bedroom home on the property and a 4-room ground level unit that was advertised in newspapers as suitable for apartments or overnight rentals, stuff like that. According to an article in the Red Oak Express, the fire chief said 2 men were working at a nearby house when they heard screams and smelled smoke. This caused them to run over to the scene at the motel. When they got there, they were unable to enter the area where they suspected the fire was because of the intense heat and dense smoke. When the fire department arrived at the motel, they found the fire was in the motel's laundry room. They were also told that a girl was believed to be inside the laundry room. Firefighters worked to control the fire, and afterwards they found the body of a girl lying on her back in the center of the room. The girl deceased was 3-year-old Keara Coshow. Investigators were never able to determine a single point of origin for the fire. The laundry room itself was 10 by 20 feet, and it was centrally located in the motel, so there were rooms on either side of the laundry room. The room contained a washer, a dryer, and a natural gas water heater. The water heater was located in the northwest corner of the room. Now, in the room, there were also storage shelves that contained a, quote, considerable amount of paint and paint products. In the room was a 1-gallon container of DuPont brand paint thinner. According to the State Fire Marshal investigation report, there were 1 to 2 inches of product left in this can, and the metal lid to the can, along with the can itself, were found on the floor a few inches from Keara's body. Investigators also noted a pile of linens beside Keara's body and wrote in their report that a noticeable odor of the paint thinner was on them. Investigators said that the room sustained extensive damage, but there was no area found with deep charring or excessive low burning, and the appearance was of an extremely fast and even fire throughout. So, from what I understand, doing some research into fire investigations, when you're looking at the level of charring, the greater the depth of charring indicates longer exposure to intense heat, which makes sense. And this can tell you about the fire's duration and intensity. One study I found discussed charring due to an ignitable liquid. It said, quote, if a liquid is poured onto a floor and ignited, the heat flux that is presented to the floor material under the liquid is very small and is of brief duration. A common outcome is a shallow singeing of the surface and not deep charring. I wasn't able to find a solid explanation on what low burning is and what the absence of excessive low burning means in this situation. Keara Coshow's body was eventually removed from the scene. Dr. Rodman Smith, the county medical examiner, performed an X-ray of the body and drew a blood sample to be sent for testing. A doctor referred to in the investigation report as Dr. P.C. Ramon Jr. in Atlantic, Iowa, was contacted to perform an autopsy. This is a snippet from the 1979 investigation report. It says, quote, the blood sample of Keara Coshow was found to contain carboxyhemoglobin, 1 sample containing 43% and 1 sample 7. The X-ray found no evidence of broken bones, although the ribcage X-ray was not satisfactory to exclude the possibility of fracture. The post-mortem report by Dr. Ramon lists the cause of death as extensive third-degree burns over 57% of total body area. No irregularities inconsistent with fire death were found. Keara's death certificate also lists her cause of death as neurogenic shock from burns to the entire body. So who was Keara Coshow, and why was she in the motel laundry room? Keara Coshow was born on August 15, 1975, to Wayne Coshow and Deborah Lee Butler. Deborah was a member of the Lakota tribe in Wisconsin. At some point, Wayne and Deborah split, and Wayne married a woman named Karen. In 1977, Wayne and Karen moved to Red Oak, Iowa. Now, there are disputes on who technically had custody of the children when they moved to Red Oak. Deborah Butler told IowaColdCases.org that Wayne and Karen did not have custody, but I don't have information to know for sure, so I can't clarify that point. I also know in my research that Keara did have sisters, Bernadette, Heather, Kedrian, and some stepsisters, but I only know at the time of her death that her older sister Bernadette was for sure living with her. So Wayne, Karen, and their children lived in the home on the Hill Top Motel property, and Karen worked at the motel. During the investigation, authorities interviewed Karen to find out what happened, and this is what the investigation report says. Chief Askey and this agent then interviewed the parents of the child, Mr. and Mrs. Wayne Coshow. The Coshows live in a building on the motel property located about 100 yards south of the laundry room. Mrs. Coshow is a full-time motel employee. Mrs. Coshow said that she had taken the girl with her at about 1:30 or 1:45 p.m. to the motel to clean some rooms. She said Keara had been playing on the doorstep of the laundry room while the mother removed sheets from rooms number 6 and 8. Mrs. Coshow said that after finishing room number 8, she had walked back to her home for a passkey to another room. At this time, she said she saw Keara still in the doorway playing with an empty pop bottle. She said the door was open at this time. Mrs. Coshow then said she was in her house for a very short time and returned to the motel area about 5 minutes after last seeing Keara. As she returned, she noticed that the door in the laundry room was closed and that Keara was not in sight. She went directly to the laundry room to get some towels needed for the room she was going to clean, but at that time had no cause for alarm. Upon reaching the laundry room, she pushed the door open and encountered heavy smoke and intense heat and flames. She had then ran back to her residence for the purpose of notifying the fire department. So with all of this, one could assume that this was a terrible accident. A little girl getting into a flammable paint thinner, somehow a fire starts, possibly from the natural gas water heater. However, there are multiple factors that make this incident very suspicious. First, in the investigation report, it is noted that authorities learned that just a few months prior to Keara's death, she had suffered an eye injury that left her almost completely blinded. This injury, according to interviews with Keara's parents during the investigation, came from her eyes coming into contact with a mixture of water and Drano. In the investigation report, it says the details of exactly how this had happened were not given, but later in the report, Dr. Redmond Smith, the medical examiner, said the Drano incident was somewhat suspicious and that there were prior suspicions of child abuse inflicted on Keara and her sister, presumably by Karen, their stepmother. Dr. Smith said, quote, the case had been turned over to social services and that a caseworker had been assigned. Sandra told investigators that Keara's vision was so bad because of the incident with the Drano that she even had difficulty finding silverware that was right in front of her. And while she had glasses, she wasn't wearing them at the time of the fire. So Karen is saying that while she was cleaning motel rooms, she went back to her home for just 5 minutes to grab a key to another room. And Keara, who was playing in the doorway to the laundry room, got in, shut the door, and then got into a gallon of paint thinner and a fire started. So, I mean, as far as timing goes, you could really dig deep into her saying she went to her home around 1:30 or 1:45, was gone for 5 minutes, came back to a fire, went and called the fire department. And you could pick that apart because the time that the fire call came in was at 2:15 p.m. So the timeline is a little off. But I do believe people are notorious for messing up time frames, so I don't know if that's really the thing to kind of nitpick. But I think it's worth thinking about how a nearly blind 3-year-old could have managed to get a gallon of paint thinner on the ground, remove the lid, dump it all over the linens, and then by some chance have something ignite and cause a fire. Sandra and Wayne were asked about the paint thinner, but apparently neither could recall having seen it, and they claimed that they weren't aware of what was actually stored in that room. But Karen appears to be working, at least as a housekeeper, at this motel, and they live on the property. This all happened in the laundry room, and just before the fire, Karen was changing out sheets in some of the motel rooms. One would expect her to be familiar with the laundry room, the room that had the linens and the washer and the dryer. Now, perhaps she didn't take a deep look at what was on the shelves in the laundry room, but surely a random can of paint thinner wouldn't just be sitting in the middle of the laundry room. The investigation report says that it was a gallon can and 1 to 2 inches of product were still in the can, and that the linens next to Keara's body had a distinctive smell of the paint thinner. This makes me believe the gallon was somewhat full beforehand. Now, a full gallon of paint weighs around 10 pounds. I wonder how a nearly blind 3-year-old could manage to get that off of a shelf and onto the ground, let alone open it. This, plus known and documented suspicions of child abuse by the stepmother, make this situation extremely suspicious, at least in my mind. There's more on this situation. Now, this information is not contained in the investigation report, but it's Keara's sister Bernadette's memory of what happened the day before the fire and the day of the fire. Bernadette would have been 5 years old at this time. There obviously have to be questions on what she can realistically remember and if she's remembering the events correctly. She has said she wasn't questioned at the time of the fire, but has been relaying this story years after the fact, so I just want you to keep that in mind. Bernadette says she experienced abuse at the hands of Karen and that her and Keara were frequently locked out of their home during the day and weren't allowed to go inside. On Wednesday, July 11th, 1979, just 1 day before the fire, Bernadette recalls Karen again locking her and Keara outside. Keara told Bernadette she had to go to the bathroom at some point, but Karen wouldn't let them in, and this caused Keara to eventually wet herself. Bernadette then recalls when Karen finally allowed the two to come inside. Karen became really angry when she saw that Keara had wet herself. Karen took both girls into the bathroom to have them take a bath. And Bernadette claims that Karen continued to get more and more angry at Keara and eventually violently shook her. Bernadette said at this point she was in the bathtub, and when Karen put Keara into the water, she was limp and unresponsive. Bernadette said she had to hold Keara's body above the water until Karen returned. Karen then took the little girl out of the water and wrapped her in a blanket. Bernadette said she never heard Keara make a sound that night and that Karen held Keara in that blanket and told Wayne that she was sick. The next day, Bernadette said she was outside on the swing set and Karen had brought Keara out in just training pants and no other clothes. Karen said Keara was still sick, so she couldn't play. Now, Bernadette says that she, along with Karen's 16-year-old daughter, Kelly, and a longtime female motel tenant, watched Karen carry Keara, still motionless, into the motel's laundry room. She said they saw Karen open the door, disappear inside with Keara, and come back out a few minutes later. Bernadette said Karen went a few doors down and then the laundry room blew up. Bernadette says that Karen never actually called 911. It was the construction workers that called. And now I have read that in other locations on this case, people assert that Karen never placed a phone call to 911, that it was just the two construction workers. I have not found anything to confirm who actually called 911. In the investigation report, it is only said that the call came in at 2:15 p.m. Now, with what Bernadette recalls, and if this is true, it does then make it impossible for Keara to have dumped the paint thinner on herself. If she was immobile, possibly even deceased by then, it makes it clear that this was an effort by Karen to cover up her abuse and stage it as an accident. But again, there's nothing in the original investigation report about this, and no notes on if they interviewed Karen's 16-year-old daughter or the longtime motel tenant who apparently also witnessed this. In the summary section of the 1979 investigation report, it says, although there was a history of child abuse and/or neglect involving Keara, this agent could find no reason to believe her death to be other than accidental. There may have been some neglect in the supervision of a nearly blind child and also violation of safety codes in storing flammable liquids in a laundry room, but there was no apparent evidence of criminal intent or neglect. Investigation of this case is considered closed. So that's where this case was at in 1979. The case was closed and was considered to be an accident. Before we move on, I want to take a moment to talk about Bernadette's recollection of Keara being injured to the point of being immobile and how that compares to her death certificate. If you recall, in the 1979 investigation report, it is said that her cause of death was extensive third-degree burns to 57% of her body, and her death certificate lists her cause of death as neurogenic shocks from burns to the entire body. It also lists other significant conditions as neurogenic shock, and the death is listed as an accident. I am not an expert in medical conditions, but I was trying to do some research into what causes neurogenic shock, and I did find overwhelmingly the resources say that the cause is injury to the spinal cord. An article in the National Library of Medicine states, neurogenic shock is characterized by organ tissue hyperperfusion due to disruption of normal sympathetic control over vascular tone. This critical condition often arises from spinal cord injuries and frequently occurs in the cervical and upper thoracic spinal cord, especially those above the T6 level. Another description states, neurogenic shock occurs when blood vessels stop working properly and don't push enough blood through the body. Now, on iowacoldcases.org, which is a wonderful organization run by Jody Ewing, a retired journalist, she writes in her summary of this case, quote, "What is still not known today is why both the autopsy report and certificate of death dutifully cite neurogenic shock and full-body burns as immediate factors in Keara's death, yet cite the manner of death as accidental. Each doctor's report makes it clear Keara had no motor function prior to the fire. The accidental ruling directly defies all information that precedes it." With that blurb from Iowa Cold Cases, I believe she is asserting and assuming a couple of things. That neurogenic shock must come from a spinal cord injury. The result of this injury would be paralysis. But she's also assuming that this injury occurred prior to the fire and not as a result of the fire. In my research into neurogenic shock, it says, yes, that it is most likely caused by a spinal cord injury. A couple of sources say that a stroke or blood clots can also cause neurogenic shock. What isn't clear to me, though, is if paralysis is a definite symptom of neurogenic shock. I asked a friend of mine who is a nurse and has worked with severe injuries like this, and she said it is possible for extensive burning to cause this type of shock. Iowa Cold Cases also writes, the x-ray found no evidence of broken bones, but did find fractures in the spinal cord. I have the investigation report, and I have the sentence that says the x-ray found no evidence of broken bones, but it does not say in there that there was evidence of fractures to the spinal cord. That is not mentioned anywhere in any of the reports I have. There is no mention of her spinal cord at all. I don't know where that piece of information came from. For this, I don't believe I have enough to know for a fact that Keara was immobile on the day of the fire and before the accident, as all I have to go off is Bernadette's recollection of an event from when she was 5 years old, and mentions of spinal injuries from an x-ray with no information on where that specifically came from. And also, I only have, my lack of knowledge on spinal cord injuries. If I could get an opinion from an expert in this area, I might feel more comfortable making an assessment on that, in addition to having other witnesses confirm Bernadette's story. But even taking away the element that she may have been immobile prior to this accident occurring, I do still think there is enough to be extremely suspicious of her death in general. The prior instances of child abuse, her being nearly blind at the time of this accident, I still think it is very suspicious. Now, with all of this, Bernadette and other relatives have maintained that this was not an accident, and they have fought for justice for Keara. Keara's aunt Sandra was steadfast in her push to have her niece's case reopened. In 2007, Sandra had gathered information, including Bernadette's recollection of that day, and presented it to a Wisconsin attorney. And the case eventually ended up in the hands of Janet Franson, a retired homicide investigator. Janet brought her investigation to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and implored them to reopen the case, which they did. And I actually submitted a records request to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation to try and figure out what occurred after the case was reopened in 2007, as there has been little to no reporting on it. I received a 2-page PDF from a DCI representative, and I will read that. All right. This is what the 2-page PDF says. On Thursday afternoon, July 12, 1979, a fire occurred at the Hill Top Motel in Red Oak, Iowa. A 3-year-old girl believed to have died in the fire was found in the laundry room by the fire department. The deceased girl's name was Keara Coshow, who was 3 years and 11 months old at the time of her death. The investigation into this fire revealed that stepmother Karen Jean Coshow stated that she worked at the motel. She lived near the motel and had her child with her. She stated that she had left the child in the laundry room briefly when the fire occurred. The investigator's opinion was that the child was playing in the laundry room with a can of paint thinner and spilled the liquid, resulting in fumes igniting from the water heater. Although there were some suspicions of child abuse by the stepmother raised during the investigation, it was ruled accidental and the case was closed. On Wednesday morning, April 11, 2007, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was contacted by an attorney named Thomas Mulligan. Mulligan, an attorney in Spooner, Wisconsin, represents Sandra Coshow, who was the child's aunt. Through her attorney, she reported to the Project Alert program at NCMEC that she believes Keara Coshow may have been murdered by Karen Jean Coshow. On Friday, April 13, 2007, the Project Alert section of the NCMEC office contacted the Iowa DCI headquarters and passed on the information they had gathered at that point. The DCI then chose to open this investigation. The second page said, on July 12, 1979, Keara Coshow died in a fire that occurred at the Hill Top Motel in Red Oak, Iowa. The original investigation into the fire ruled it as accidental and the case was closed. In April 2007, the DCI was contacted and asked to reopen the case due to suspicions by the victim's aunt, Sandra Coshow. The case was reopened and an investigation completed. The information received from the investigation was reviewed with the county attorney and the findings being consistent with the original ruling as accidental. I respectfully request this case be closed. Keara's case was reopened on April 13, 2007, and closed again on May 17, 2010. They provided no additional information on their reinvestigation, nothing on who they contacted, who they spoke with, if they did any additional testing, none of that. Sandra Coshow passed away in 2013, and Keara's biological mother, Deborah, passed away in 2024. Bernadette has continued to demand justice for her little sister. She has created a Facebook page to talk about her sister, and in one of the posts she says, I believe one day the truth will come out. I don't know how, but it will. Whether it is because we were just 2 Indian girls in a predominantly white population and our life was less important, I don't know, but we were cast off. Keara's story has been featured in articles highlighting the lack of attention and resources given to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Native American and Alaska Native rates of murder, rape, and violent crime are all much higher than the national averages. Despite this, their cases receive much less attention and resources. According to 2016 data from the National Crime Information Center, there were almost 6,000 reports of missing Indigenous women and girls, but the National Information Clearinghouse and Resource Center for Missing, Unidentified, and Unclaimed Persons in the United States, called NamUs, only logged 116 of those cases. The organization Native Hope discusses the reason why there is this disparity and also overwhelming silence on the issue. They say, quote, at the forefront lie issues stemming from the Indian Relocation Act and other federal policies. Many Native Americans do not live on the tribal lands or reservations, and many frequent a lifestyle of transience between tribal and state lands. This presents a variety of issues involving reporting policies, jurisdictional complications, and communication and coordination problems in between agencies. I will link to that organization and others in the description of this episode. Keara Coshow was just 3 years old when she died, and she was just a month away from turning 4. Her life was taken way too soon, either by deliberate actions or by the complete negligence and lack of care and attention given to her by her stepmother. Family members of Keara who have been demanding justice deserve answers and reassurance that her death was investigated thoroughly, taking into account all of the factors we have discussed today. Although this case is considered closed, if you have any information at all, please contact Iowa's Cold Case Unit at 800-242-5100 or email coldcase@ag.iowa.gov. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.